on decision bias about a year ago, and that recording is on our website. So we're not going to really touch on decision bias. We're going to look at the mechanisms by which we make decisions. So, Richard, where's my poll?
Oh, sorry. I thought I took mounted over somewhere. There we go. Poll.
So let's just start off by talking about what do we think is a good decision, and hopefully in a minute my poll will put, yep, there it is. So please vote what you think is a good decision for you. So you can explain it logically. It just feels right. Everyone agrees with you, or you always worry whether you've actually made the right decision. What resonates for you there? Interesting. We can explain it logically, followed by it feels right. Interesting. Thank you very much. Okay, so most people want to be able to explain why they've made the decision they've made. And a few of you are just more concerned about what it feels like. So let's see what the kind of science says about that. This sort of became very personal for me as I was putting this together, because I'm moving house at the moment. I sold my property at the end of March and I'm now in a rental, so I'm looking to buy a new home. And it kind of got me thinking about what's going on with that decision, which is obviously quite a big one. Probably the biggest financial decision most of us ever make is buying a property. So there are some very logical things that make up that decision. So kind of location, as they say, location, location, location. So I want a nice street, good transport links, and as I'm in East London, somewhere that's relatively safe. And then there were things that I specified. I've got a search company helping me, so there were things that I specified, obviously the price or within a price range, how much work I would do on the property. And then as I've been looking at houses, other things have popped up, like does it have enough storage space? If you write books, you've always got hundreds of the blooming things in boxes waiting to be sent off to Amazon, so you need space to store it. I've also got a fairly large wardrobe in the sense of I've got a lot of clothes, so being able to accommodate them is quite important. And then I work from home quite often, so having office space is important to me. So those are all the kind of relatively rational things that are important in this decision to buy a home. But on the right-hand side are all the things that are kind of, if you like, muddying the water, which you don't often articulate but do influence your decisions, or at least these types of decisions. So one of them is, what will my friends and family think of a house? I took my daughter and my oldest friend to see a house on Monday morning, and they both hated it, which was kind of really shook me and made me kind of step back and think a bit more about whether that should be a property I made an offer on. And then, you know, as I've gone through the search, some of my criteria about what's important has changed. And like most people, I like to think I'm consistent. So it's quite uncomfortable starting to say to people, oh, I've decided on, for example, a bigger house than I'd originally started looking for. I was meant to be downsizing. I'm not actually downsizing at all for very good reasons, like I can't fit my books in. These smaller houses don't have enough wardrobes, and there's no room for an office. So whilst that's sort of fairly logical, it causes you some problems around consistency. And then finally, as many of you talked about in the poll, you like to be able to rationally explain about your decisions. So with me, I like to be able to explain to my search agency what I think about a house and what I don't. But the reality is the biggest factor is an intuitive one, which is hard to name, but it's kind of that piece that I've put here in the middle of, is it me? Can I see myself living here? And that's actually really quite hard. So I'm not wittering on about my house buying for no reason. I think these are all the sorts of factors that influence other decisions that people make, including quite simple decisions like what you're going to have for lunch. So there's a lot more going on than just the kind of logic. And traditionally, economists have described a good decision as one that aligns with what people should do if they made the optimal choice. Now, and I think that's how we often think about decisions in business, that we can lay out all of the pros and cons, and, you know, as a leadership team or as a HR team, we can make that optimal decision. The reality is that very few decisions actually have those optimal choices. There's always a compromise along the way somewhere, a bit like, you know, there's going to be a compromise around this house. The question is just which of all of those things that I think are important am I going to eventually compromise on. So these issues have led behavioral economists to kind of shift what we think about as a good decision from one that's optimal, one that's rational, if you like, to one that makes us happy and that we can stay committed to. And if you go back to house buying, I guess that's a pretty practical way to think about it. You know, the house may not have everything you want, but can you be happy with it? And in business, I guess that's very similar. You know, you're always going to be taking some practical considerations around a strategy or a policy in business. So I'd be quite interested for people to type into the chat area what they think about those two ways of describing what's a good decision. While you're doing that, we can have another poll. So how much of your decision making is logical and rational versus intuitive? Most of it, people are saying you trust your gut and like to check the data. So a mix between that and most of it's logical. Interesting. Yeah, we've got basically about 50-50 there. People who trust their gut but check the data, and then people who think it's mostly logical. Okay, so what's science actually saying? Well, for those of you who said most of your decisions are made on rational, logical, I'm afraid science would say to you actually very little is based on that. The data that we use, well, let's look at this. So what we know is from research by Antonio Damasio is that all of our decisions have an emotional element. He believes that emotions kind of tag a decision and tell us whether it's good, bad, or neutral. And it's that sense in our bodies, that emotional sense, which will drive us towards one type of decision or another. And data it's true that emotion has been put together, has been tagged, if you like, based on historic data, but it's probably not terribly important what the current data is saying to you. So some people believe that something like 1 to 9% of decisions occur in our conscious mind, that much more of what we're deciding is already decided in that emotional way in our brain, and then we articulate a story around why we believe that. So that the people who said, I go with my gut, but then I like to look at the data, there's probably a lot of evidence from a brain science point of view that says that is actually what we do. We like to be consistent and we like to be able to explain things, but rather than it being the data that makes us decide and then we tell the story, if you like, it's actually probably the emotion that makes us decide, and then we find the data to go around it. And I often think of someone I worked in the city with who was a very successful equity strategist. So he told the investment people where to put our pension money, basically. And what he confessed to me was that all of his strategy was based on his gut reaction, and he then went and looked for the data that backed it up and wrote that into the papers that the investment managers actually use to decide where they put their money. And Damasio found that one of his very kind of famous studies was with a group of people where he asked people who had normal brains, people like you and me, to play a gambling game. So they were given $20 and they were asked to bet on the toss of a coin. The coin was just a normal coin. And they got $2.50 for every time they got the right bet, so whether it was heads or tails. And if they got the wrong answer, then they lost $1. Now, logically, what we should do there is always bet, because the laws of probability say we're more likely to win than we are to lose. But what he found was people with intact brains became fearful, particularly after they'd had a few wins, of losing that money and stopped betting. Whereas people with damage to their amygdala, which is the emotional center of the brain, never felt that fear and went on betting and actually did better than the people with intact brains. And what Damasio says is that those people with damage to those emotional centers found it very, very hard to make decisions, to make choices. So, when he would ask them, when do you want your next appointment, those people would be able to talk through all the pros and cons of different appointment dates, or all the pros and cons of a choice of restaurant for lunch, but they weren't able to actually finalize where they wanted to go or what date they wanted to have their appointment, because they didn't have that emotional tag which told them whether it was a good day or a bad day, or a good restaurant or a bad restaurant. So what he says is our brains are actually designed to use both logic and emotions in balance. And if you look at the structure of the brain, actually the logical and the emotional parts of where we make decisions are very densely connected in the brain. So it's obviously been designed to use both of those systems, if you like. So I'm just looking at what some people are saying in the chat box. So we've got Tracy saying, I think instincts are extremely important and there for a reason. Yep. A good one here, let's make a decision that's good enough. Yeah, there's lots of, the more complex a decision is, the more important it is to be practical, because you're never going to get kind of something that's completely optimal. And then David's saying, as time goes on, it becomes more emotional for me, e.g., I need a new house now, which means greater compromise. Yeah, interesting that you're also moving, David. So, and understanding what are our personal things that will allow us to make those compromises, is what other criteria are important, and I think important if we're trying to influence other people to make decisions. So let's look at some of what goes on in our brain. And as you might have intuited, we have two systems in the brain. And this is the work of Thinking Fast and Slow. Many of you may have read that book. So what that book explains is that we have two systems. So system one is fast, instinctive, it's emotional, and it's specialized in making decisions very, very quickly, usually to keep us safe or to ensure we get a reward. So it's particularly focused on things like safety, food, sex, and social connection, and it's entirely automatic. So this is the kind of 91 to 99% of where all our decisions are made. And part of the reason for that is, A, it's speedy, and B, it's very robust under cognitive load. So if you're very stressed or you're very busy or you've got a lot of decisions to make, this feels easier to make decisions from this system. It's also designed to make us feel certain, and we know the brain likes to have a sense of certainty. It likes to predict about what's going to happen. So again, when we make decisions from this system, they feel right, and we've incorporated that language into our everyday speech. The trouble with this system is that it takes shortcuts, and those shortcuts may not be actually kind of taking into account all of the factors. This is where bias comes in, obviously. So those shortcuts may be good, but they can also lead us down the wrong path. So our other system is called System 2. Now, this is the system that we think is in charge, but, as we're learning, probably isn't. Partly because it's much slower and it takes more deliberation. So this is the system that's looking for the rational data. It's looking to analyze that data. It's looking to make connections across different types of data, all of which is really good, but it gets tired very easily, and it's, as Daniel Kahneman says, it's quite lazy. So we tend to go with System 1 because it feels effortful to bring this System 2 online. So I'd be quite interested to know whether people have read this book, what they think about this idea of two systems, and how easy you find it is to bring that System 2 online when you've already made an intuitive decision about something. And how consciously, what are some of your techniques for actually bringing that more rational, logical data into your decision? How often does it overturn your your intuitive feeling? So, any views on that from people who are on the webinar? Yeah, that's exactly right. System 1 is heuristics. So that's the shortcuts that we take in our brain that social psychologists talk about. And many of those are what we think of as biases. So in the experiment that we talked about earlier of betting, we know that one of those shortcuts is to be fearful of loss more so than of gains, and so that tends to make us very risk averse. And we've got someone here saying, I think too much System 2 can actually lead us to procrastinate and overthink. That's absolutely right. And we often see that with System 2 used almost as an excuse, particularly, I think, in business, where you've got like a management team, for example, that will ask for more data rather than make a decision that in their System 1 feels uncomfortable. And so we go to System 2 because of that discomfort when the decision may not be kind of socially acceptable or the way people thought it was going to go, and I've certainly seen that with my house buying decisions. One aha I had was the superpower of reflection to connect System 1 and System 2. Peter, that's absolutely right, and we're going to go on and talk about some of the science around reflection and mindfulness. Lynn saying, I use System 1 when making personal decisions. I try hard to use System 2 when making business decisions, which leads to, again, procrastination. I work in the System 1 area due to lack of time and a demanding job. Elka, I have to remember that. Elka works with us on a number of client things. And interestingly, though, Elka, you work with clients who believe everything's System 2. System 1 has kept me going for a while, though, says Rachel. Very good. So a lot of agreement, I think, here that, System 1 is where it's at rather than System 2, although we're pushed to try and explain things through our System 2. So what does that all mean? And what unconsciously impacts those decisions? So we've got, two things going on here. We've got System 1 and System 2 driving our decisions, but the things that influence those System 1 and System 2 are multiple. So some really interesting research by a guy called John Coates on the impact of hormones on decision making. So Coates is quite an interesting character because he's a city trader. He works for one of the big banks and then got interested in neuroscience and went and retrained as a neuroscientist. So went and did a PhD in neuroscience. And what he did was go back to the city and got permission to actually take blood tests of traders through different trading scenarios, so good days and bad days, an active market, a less active market. And what he found was that the neurochemicals in their blood varied, and he could relate that to their trading strategy on any one day. So when testosterone was very high and they tended to be more risk-orientated, as soon as cortisol got very high, they became much more risk-averse. And Coates talks about, this was sort of one of the reasons for the financial crash, that there was so much testosterone going around trading rooms that people began to kind of become overconfident about their trading strategies. And that went on and on and on until such a point where, because cholesterol and testosterone tend to go up together, they reached a tipping point that kind of pushed them over the edge, and that's why we had the kind of financial crash. And other scientists have recognized that it's a good time to make decisions in the morning when serotonin is at an all-time high, and that tends to mean that our brain is calm and we make much better quality decisions, things that are not too risky or too risk-averse. There's also been research that says if we're hungry or uncomfortable, like we're lacking fluids, lacking water, we're more likely to take risky decisions. We take a much more risk-averse when we're comfortable. Mood we've already talked about. So are you feeling optimistic or pessimistic will make you look at data in a different way. And there's evidence that if we've had a lack of sleep, that too will influence our decisions. So we're likely to make more risky decisions if we're sleep deprived. And here's the one about reflection that someone talked about. So research by someone called David Creswell, who's at Carnegie Mellon University, has found that even a few seconds reflection when you're dealing with a lot of data that you need to consider to make a decision is very helpful, and that, as judged by experts, people who have time for reflection tend to make better decisions, and even better if it's a complex decision. If you sleep on it, you'll probably also make a better decision. So that old saying of it's also always better to sleep on a decision is actually backed up by science. Sorry, Tracy, you're asking about John Coates. What was John Coates? John Coates is a neuroscientist who's done work on how hormones affect the levels of risk in city traders. So serotonin is high in the mornings. So making important decisions in the morning is likely to be preferable to later in the day when your serotonin drops. And then research with judges, interesting. Sentencing, lenient, yeah, that's right. There is research that judges who are looking at parole cases or sentencing of people who've been found guilty tend to make harsher decisions just before lunch, so when they're hungry. And also that they make harsher decisions later in the day when they've had to make lots of other decisions. So the quality of their decisions changes when they have to make lots of other decisions. That original research hypothesized that was because glucose was low in the brain. There's some questions about whether that's right, but there is definitely a phenomena of decision fatigue. And anyone who goes shopping for clothes will have recognized that themselves. You know, the first thing you buy is usually quite good. When you keep buying things, the later decisions tend to be the ones where you've made some less than great purchases. Yeah, and that can influence things like interviews. So if you've got a day of interviews, the basis on which you're making decisions at the very beginning and at the very end are probably quite different. So we know immediacy is a bias, so things that, or primacy is a bias, so things that we knew at the beginning of, say, a decision-making process, say data we look at first, will have more influence on us than things that come later. And then finally, we know social reputation is really important to us. So another thing that we know will impact our decision is what other people will think of it. And whether our in-group, the people we think are important to us or we feel are important to us, are likely to agree with that decision or find it disagreeable, will influence what decisions we make. So, you know, I mentioned this with my house. One of the considerations is, will my family and friends think it's a good house for me to have purchased? That's a factor. You know, why should it be really? They're not going to live there. But it is nonetheless an important factor because our social reputation with people who are important to us matters. And I think we see that played out in business quite a lot. You know, one way we know it's quite helpful to influence people is by them knowing what other peers have decided about a new policy, for example. So I don't know how much you see social reputation influencing decisions in your business. I'd be interested to hear what people think about that. So what does all this mean in practice for your decisions? So what the science would say to us is, yes, listen to your gut, but then check with your system too. So check with the data, and as much data as you can, in a way, within the realms of, you know, not procrastinating over your decision, and definitely give yourself some time for reflection, particularly if it's a complex decision. Check your mood. So your mood will, to some extent also determine what those neurochemicals are, which ones are predominant. And we know, people in a positive mood are much more able to make connections across complex bits of data. So we've got some answers here to my question about social reputation. We've got Peter saying, I think social reputation is very important in organisations. Gets bigger and more matrix. As organisations get bigger and more matrix, formal lines are blurred. Yeah, and so what's going on there, Peter, is who is important if you're trying to influence someone's decision, for you to know who are the in-group people for that person, your stakeholder you're trying to influence. So, who is it going to be important that will they look to in terms of whether that they're kind of on board with the decision or not? And then we've got someone saying, social reputation is important where I work. Getting the SMT, presumably that's a management committee, to agree is more likely if you've spoken to individuals beforehand and can tell peers that X and Y agree. Yep. So often called social proof in psychology, that knowing people who are like me agree with this decision will greatly influence people. So agree with Peter, the best way to get agreement to decisions is to try them out with others. Yeah, so that's another way of doing that. So what else should you be thinking about? So try to take different perspectives. That's some of what we're seeing here in the chat box. So one of the things we know that can be really powerful is to put distance between your decision by thinking about what will this decision look like in a year's time, for example. Or, if I was a fly on the wall, how would I view this interaction between two people and therefore the decision that I made? And also being in touch with, does this fit with my purpose and values? I think when we're really busy and we're needing to make lots of decisions, that can often be something that slips. We talked about making important decisions in the morning and when you're physically comfortable and have eaten and are well hydrated, and giving yourself time to reflect on data. Excuse me, one moment. I have someone at my door. Hello? Can you just leave it there, please? Thanks. Sorry about that, everybody. One decision you should make is not to answer your door in the middle of a webinar. So give yourself time to reflect on data. And there's a lot of evidence that if you study or have a practice of mindfulness, your decision-making also tends to be better balanced. And if you think about it, mindfulness is really enables us to step back from something and to observe the kind of all the factors with less kind of emotional contagion. So mindfulness, people who practice mindfulness tend to make more balanced decisions. We've talked about sleeping on important decisions, and then finally checking for any unconscious bias. And, the bottom line is we are all biased, but we can test some of those biases by, is that the removal van? Thank you. No, I'm not quite there yet. I haven't found the house. So we can check for biases by seeking others' opinion. Reflection, again, helps. And then unbundling our assumptions and testing what's really gone into that decision. So, Richard, you're going to put some of the references up. So I think we've got the reference to the link to both Damasio's book and Thinking Fast and Slow. And I think I also gave you the link, Richard, to the unconscious bias
You have. I'll just start to
webinar.
now.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah.
So if people want to have a look at that, there we go. So the other thing we said we'd talk a bit about is how do you influence other people's decisions? So I think what the science is telling us, a few things to consider. And the first one is what are their emotions? So what's their emotional starting point about whatever it is you're trying to influence them on? And we've just done some work with some lawyers in a law firm, and we asked them this question around their pitching to clients. You know, how much time in putting their pitch together did they consider emotionally where the client may be about them as a firm and their proposition? And the answer was almost none at all, even though they were really very skilled at reading the room and being able to adapt the kind of tone of what they were saying or the detail of what they were saying to the client in the moment. In their preparation, that wasn't something they thought about. And I think this is probably one of the biggest things that you could kind of do that will improve your ability to influence other people. So understanding what their emotional start point is and how you can shift those emotions towards where you need them to be as you kind of reveal your proposition or your proposal. So building in that emotional, logical argument as well as the logical argument to your proposal or presentation. And I'm interested in how many people actually consciously do that when they're trying to influence the management team or your boss or your children and husband. How much are you taking into account where emotionally they might be? And then linked to that, we often talk about our core model. So core stands for certainty, options, reputation, and equity. And we know that from a brain perspective, each of those can either create a threat response if it's negative or a reward response in the brain. So, how do you understand your stakeholders' core? So how will what you're proposing impact their levels of certainty? Will they have options? Does it enhance their social reputation? And does it feel equitable? Can they see that it's fair to them and others? So Michelle's saying that she does tend to think about their reaction, what may their questions, etc. be, and to try and incorporate this in any decision I'm putting forward. Yeah. And do you also think about emotionally how they feel about it as opposed to what they think about it? I think for me that's the crux of this. Yeah, and their personality traits will, I guess, give you some hints towards that. Yeah, time pressure stops us doing this. So there's old system 1 coming in and helping us avoid to think about system 2. So in order to think about someone's emotional state, we have to use system 2. But what we're trying to tap into is what's their system 1. So Peter's saying he often uses SCARF. Yeah, CORE is our version of SCARF based on the same science that David Rock used. And then the other thing to think about is how do you prime someone? So I think we already had you coming up with some examples of that where you're kind of talking to people outside of the formal decision-making meeting. And that can often be, how are you sort of getting them comfortable with the decision? So you're often maybe, increasing their levels of certainty when we link back to that core model, or talking to them about what would be the important options for them. So again, we know, for example, in business, that if you prime people to think about the people consequences of certain decisions, they're much more able to take that into account. And then finally, we know that things that make people more likely to say yes to a proposition is that there's social proof. We've talked about that already. Other people agree with it. Reciprocity, have you done a favour for them in the past and they feel they owe you a favour? How much they perceive that what you're proposing is, or that you personally are like them and are likeable. Is there some authority that's going to influence them? That's often why people use consultants. An authority may be data as well. And then we know that people are very influenced to decide on something if they think there's a scarcity value, if they think there's only so many people who can attend the program, for example, or buy the handbag or get the shares. All of those make people tend more to say yes. And then finally, we've mentioned consistency. So if you can get someone to agree publicly to something, they're much more likely to stick with that decision. And I think the other consideration is if you can get people to feel comfortable in both systems. So if you can get them to feel comfortable with intuitively this is the right decision, as well as the data backing that up, those tend to be the decisions that stick. So we've got Gail asking, how much does trust and reputation factor? So I think reputation factors enormously. And when you're influencing someone else, obviously trust is important. Because if they don't trust you, they're probably not going to listen to your arguments. And one thing we know from the research on trust is that if you trust someone else, for example, to make a wise decision, then they become more trustworthy. So they're more likely to go in the direction that you're going in. So it becomes a kind of virtuous circle. The opposite can happen, of course. If they don't trust you, then they won't trust the data that you're presenting to them. So that's what I had today. I just want to mention, as we've got a relatively new book, I'm again giving away 10 copies this month. So the first people to send me their postal address, please. The first 10 people, and please do send your postal address because you'd be surprised how few people do this. So if you'd like a copy of Brain Savvy Business, please, take that opportunity. We also have a Brain Savvy Leaders LinkedIn group, so we can continue the conversation here. And finally, David's Pay Compliment website, that's our ID number. If you would like to give us some feedback, I'd really like to understand either on the chat box or via that website what you thought of today's webinar and how useful it is. So our time is up. Thank you again. Can you send your postal address?
They're coming in now.
Okay, we'll leave it.
They're all coming in.
I'll pick them up from there, Richard.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep.
You can email me at janhills@hhab.co.uk in case you don't have time to do it while the chat's still up. So thank you, everyone. Have a brilliant day. Hope the sunshine continues for those of you who had it and the clouds move away for those of you who didn't. Thank you.